The film begins with a brief explanation of the work of saturation divers, who are responsible for maintaining the pipelines that extend to the bottom of the ocean. The divers can reach depths of more than 300 meters, where sunlight barely penetrates, and that is not to mention the various difficulties they face. It is one of the best jobs in the world, but also one of the most dangerous. In the next scene, we meet Chris Lemons, a Scottish diver who has just been called in for a month of work. This interrupts his plans with his fiancée, Morag, who, far from being upset, is concerned about the nature of Chris's job. He assures her that it is like being in space, but underwater. He doesn't think that makes it any less unsettling. Despite his fiancée's nerves, Chris loves being a diver and arrives at Aberdeen Port, the diving operations base in the North Sea, with a smile. Among his colleagues, he meets Donan Alcock, a veteran diver and good friend. At the time of selecting the diving teams, the supervisor, Craig, gathers Chris, Donan, and Mr. Sympathy, David Yassa, a grumpy fellow who only carries that nickname for his lack of charisma. However, Chris introduces himself with his best attitude, admitting that he had wished to work with him. Despite their differences, the divers settle into their new home for the next 28 days, a pressurized chamber that simulates conditions similar to those 90 meters underwater. Thanks to this, they can remain at the required pressure throughout their shift. As soon as he arrives, Chris pins a photo of his fiancée on his bunk, and David quickly warns him that once the chamber is sealed, everything outside becomes a distraction. Before Chris can respond, Duncan tells him not to pay any attention. David is only for work. Outside, he is more relaxed. Once the divers are in their respective chambers, the doors are closed, and the vessel sets sail for its destination. The divers kill time by engaging in their hobbies and chatting with each other. In his case, Don Kay recounts how rudimentary diving was in his youth. He is one of the few left from that era, and perhaps for that reason they want to retire him. This news surprises both Chris and David, as Duncan had kept it to himself until now. Although a break wouldn't be unwelcome, he can't help feeling that he has another 10 years left in the tank. In that context, Chris promises him that this last dive together will be memorable, and it certainly will be. Upon reaching the dive zone, the vessel's captain, Andre Jensen, worries about the weather conditions, as a strong storm is battering the seas. However, Craig reminds him that this is the North Sea, and he gives the divers the green light. During the preparations, Donan assumes the role of lookout from the diving bell, which means that Crazy and David must descend. Therefore, David tells his colleague to follow him at all times. With all three in position, the bell begins its descent until reaching a depth of 91 meters. Although there are some turbulences due to the storm, these divers are not new to the game. At least David and Duncan are not. David is the first to plunge into the water, followed by Chris. They face 6 long hours in utter darkness. Duncan remains in the bell, monitoring his companion's condition and distributing the umbilical lines that provide them with communication, energy, and oxygen. Upon reaching the seafloor, the divers head to the designated collector, powering it up with electricity before beginning to repair the pipelines. Everything goes well in the depths, although on the surface the situation is different. Suddenly, the ship's dynamic positioning system, SPD, starts to fail, causing the thrusters to shut off. As a result, the vessel is dragged by the marine currents. From the depths, David sees this and warns Chris to immediately exit the collector. Then Chris and David decide to climb onto the collector to avoid further complications. David makes it up without problems, but Chris's umbilical cord loses tension before his ascent, becoming entangled in the collector's structure. Inevitably, the diving bell is carried by the ship, dragging Chris along with it. Despite his efforts to hold on, his cord begins to break, abruptly interrupting his oxygen supply. Remaining calm, David tells him to switch to his emergency reserve, which gives him an estimated 10 minutes of oxygen. Aware of what is happening, David clarifies that in a matter of seconds, his rope will break completely, so he advises him to stay on top of the collector. This way, David can return for him afterward. While David is being dragged by the bell, Chris falls toward the depths. Duncan realizes the gravity of the situation in the worst possible way when he retrieves the broken cord from the water. Chris's accident mobilizes the entire crew. Craig and Jensen begin planning a way to rescue him. They cannot anchor due to the proximity of several gas lines. Cutting one of them could trigger an ecological catastrophe that the captain is not willing to risk. With 8 minutes of oxygen remaining, Chris lights a flare on the seabed. Desperately, he calls out to his comrades, but there is only darkness and silence. Refusing to give up, he remembers that David recommended he climb onto the collector. This has now become his goal. On the surface, the crew realizes that the thrusters are not damaged. They simply shut down because of the SPD failure. Therefore, Jensen and the first officer decide to manually maneuver the thrusters to stay close to Chris. This is a tactic generally used in ports, but the current situation justifies it. With his limited light, Chris reaches the collector and begins to climb it. Mid-ascent, his flare falls off. Luckily, he has another. Once at the top, the diver feels his oxygen running out, and with it, his very life. He recalls the last message from his fiancée, who begged him to come home safely after this job. The oxygen meter hits 0. The countdown for time without oxygen begins. On board the vessel, Officer Mike receives the order to expedite the SPD's restart, which normally takes several hours. At the same time, Operator Andrew tries to locate Chris using an RB vehicle. Although he manages to find him on the collector, the diver has fallen unconscious from the lack of oxygen and is having involuntary spasms. He has now been in that state for 7 minutes, clinging to life. Craig suggests using the RB's pincers to rescue Chris, but Andrew does not dare to do so. Since that vehicle is normally used to transport bodies, the pincers could be dangerous. Nevertheless, Craig refuses to let one of his men die, so he takes control of the ROB. Following Andrew's advice, Craig manages to grab the harness of Chris's suit with the pincer. Unfortunately, when he begins the ascent, he encounters another barrier, as the diver had clung to the collector to avoid being dragged away by the tide. It has been 16 minutes without oxygen and counting. During the tense wait, Duncan tells David about the day he met Chris. In fact, it was under rather sad circumstances, as they were assigned to recover the bodies from a shipwreck. Despite all their efforts, they did not manage to find the last body, so the deceased's wife received only a box with his belongings. Through tears, Duncan refuses to give Morag the same fate. David, for his part, assures him that it will not be so. They are going to recover their friend. Just at that moment, Mike manages to manually restart the SPD, which allows the vessel to approach the collector precisely. They also regain communication with the Bell, where Duncan and David inform them that Chris is still alive. Once near the collector, David dives down to unanchor Chris and bring him along, or at least that is what he attempts, since they submerge the Bell as far as possible, and that has consequences. However, David manages to hold on to the cord, while Donan gives him strength to climb up to the Bell. After a titanic effort, the diver reaches his destination with Chris, ending his oxygenless countdown at a total of 28 minutes. Duncan performs mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on him, and miraculously, his young friend begins to breathe again. The problem is that he only does that. He does not respond to any other type of stimulus. Despite this, Duncan thanks his comrade for bringing him back. He responds that they both did it. At least they will have something to give back to Morag. That's right, the dead man is speaking, and that is because he is not dead. Chris is alive. The ship is in an uproar, everyone celebrating the miracle they achieved together. The irony is that Chris has no idea what is going on. Duncan jokingly mentions that they kissed, but the details are for later. Finally, the captain orders the diver to be taken home. With the Bell back on board, the decompression process begins, while Duncan and David take charge of Chris's recovery. When Chris learns that he was without oxygen for so long, he admits that he should have died. The diver cannot help but feel guilty for his wife, remembering that he promised to return to her arms safe and sound. He was on the verge of not doing so. When David is about to let him rest, he stops him by taking his hand and sincerely thanking him for saving his life. Thanks to him, his fiancée will have a husband. After that, David pulls a photo of his 2 daughters from his pocket, knowing all too well what Chris feels. Now recovered, Chris calls Morag and informs her that he will be coming home earlier than expected due to a problem on the ship. On his last day of decompression, the divers leave their chambers and return to dry land. However, Duncan turns around, and under the pretext of retrieving something he forgot, spends a long time at the chamber. He cannot believe that this is his last time there. Sig, who was watching him through the cameras, asks what is happening. Dongkan replies that he doesn't feel ready to be discarded. Changing the scenario, Chris finally returns home and tells his wife that there was an incident with a diver. He got trapped on the seabed and they had to go down to rescue him. Chris barely elaborates. He doesn't need to give more details. Soon, Morag realizes that the diver was him. A wave of anguish washes over her, even though Chris assures her that he always knew he would return to her. The real Chris Lemon spent 29 minutes without oxygen in his body. Despite theories in the scientific community, the truth is that no one has yet managed to explain how he could survive for so long. Against all odds, with his fiancée's marriage on the line, and barely 3 weeks after the accident, he returned to the depths of the North Sea, along with his friends David and Duncan, to finish the job he had left pending.